Age marks the last dynasty of the late ancient era. So it is very relevant to study the major changes that came about in the social and economic lives of the people as compared to the earlier period of ancient Indian history. In our last episode, we had talked about the land measurement and distribution systems. We had also spoken of craft and mercantile organizations and concluded the session with a dialogue on urbanization. In today's episode, we shall deal with trade and commerce and also examine the changes that came about in society since the later Vedic age.
Trade had been a very important activity in the course of the various civilizations which came up in India. We have reference to internal trade and external trade in the days of the Indus culture. We have reference to very brisk internal trade and a vast external international trade in the times of the Kushanas, and the Gupta period was also no exception to this. We have records that the Gupta peace provided ample opportunities for the free movement of men and goods from one place to the other, and Fahin, the Chinese traveler who lived in India from 399 AD to 414 AD, was very much impressed by this freedom of movement, which was, of course, not perhaps did not exist in his own society in China. And from Fayan's record, we know that there was free movement of men and goods from one part of the country to the other part, and the mode of transport was also different. There was a very well-connected land route during this period, but the water routes were also prominent, and this was important especially in the middle Ganga Valley and the lower Ganga Valley, which was crisscrossed by rivers, and the Gupta traders made very good use of these water routes which were provided. And we find reference to different kinds of transport for the modes of transport for the water routes. There is reference to the rafts, there is reference to the different boats called the Tarani, the Droni, and there is also reference to the Pota Vanika.
The crew of the merchant vessel included the bonik or the merchant, the niyamoko or the pilot, and the karnodhar or the person who steered the oar and the vessel. The mention of such vessels indicate that riverine traffic was well known and well used. We also find in the Gunaiga CP of copper plate of Vainagupta, a reference is made to the Nojog or the boat parking stations. In the Bengal inscriptions of the 6th century AD, we find reference to no Bandhok or no Dandok, which also refer to boat parking stations. Obviously, these stations were used for inland transport, and it is here that the ships docked and all the required provisions were made for their journey.
While we refer to this, it is very important to mention a very important port in Bengal, southern Bengal, Tamralipti, which was on the right bank of river Rupnarayan, and its great importance lay in the great hinterland which it provided. The importance of Tamralipti is evident from the fact that we have found many things, many archaeological evidences. We have precious beads, we have the terracotta plaques which tell us about the urban life of Tamralipti. We have found coins, and all these are indicative of the affluence of Tamralipti, and this affluence can be related to its commercial importance. Fahian also visited Tamralipti, and it can be mentioned with importance that Fahian took his return journey by a boat from Tamralipti, from where he went to Sri Lanka. From Sri Lanka, he went to Java, and from Java, he went to his home, that is China. And this way, we can say that Bengal and its port, especially ports like Tamralipti, was not only important in the internal water trade, but also the international trade via the Bay of Bengal, which ran into the Indian Ocean.
Tamralipti had an extensive hinterland and was well connected with regions of Southeast Asia. From Southeast Asia, we find an inscription, to be more specific, from Wellesley in the Malay Peninsula. We find an inscription which mentions the Mohanabik Buddhagupta, who came from a region called Raktomiktika. Raktomiktika has been identified with Raktomiktika Mohabihar in the Murshidabad district. Obviously, then, we find India had connections with Southeast Asia during this period, and ports on the eastern coast played an important role in this regard.
So we find that there is reference to the growing eastern trade and a decline in the western trade. This decline in the western trade, which was very brisk in the early eras of the Christian century, might have declined because of the decline in demand for Indian merchandise in the Roman Empire, which was also in the decline. But there was a recovery of the position and the growing importance of Persian Gulf water route, as suggested by the Byzantine and the Sassanid records. We find the Cosmos Indicopleustis, which was a Christian book on topography. There is reference to trade of India in the western ports, and this might have inspired the Guptas to conquer Kathiawar and the Gujarat region, and there was a revival of the western trade as well. But as records would suggest, in this period, the eastern region played a very important role in the internal and international trade of India.
The Guptas are credited with the minting of superb gold and silver coins. Several hoards of the Gupta gold coins have been discovered. They bear eloquent testimony to the prosperous conditions of their realm, not only by their high gold content, but also by their superb artistic execution.
We find that gold coins, superb quality gold coins in hoards, have been discovered from various parts of northern India. The coins that were executed during the earlier period were minted according to the Kushan standard, and later on we find that Skandagupta increased the standard from the regular 124 grains to 144 grains. However, we find gradually the gold content in the gold coins lessened, and this debasement perhaps indicate the gradual economic decline of the empire. However, in spite of this debasement in coinage, we find that they continued to execute the coins of 144 grains, and gold coins continued to be minted by the Gupta monarchs. Chandragupta II, the king who succeeded Samudragupta, was the first to execute silver coins, especially after conquering the Shaka realms in western India. These coins were minted according to the standard of the Shaka Kshatraps of western India. it was Kandagupta who continued minting of silver coins, and after him Buddhagupta continued minting of silver coins, but after that we do not know whether these coins were executed. After again, along with silver and gold, we find minting of copper coins, though they have not been found in large quantities. We know that copper coins must have been used for regular transactions, but the paucity or the lesser availability of coins have led the proponents of Indian feudalism to suggest that this shows that the use of coinage went out of existence. We are not sure about their claims, but what we can say here that Fahian claims that cowrie shells were used for transactions. Probably this was due to the minting of lesser quantity of coins.
The agrarian sector of the economy provided the bulk of the financial resources required for sustaining the vast administrative structure of the Guptas. Mention is made of bhaga, or the king's share, which was probably 1/6 of the produce. Kara and Uparikara are denoted by D.C. Shorkar as the principal and subsidiary taxes respectively. Utranga was probably a tax on permanent subjects, while Halika Kara and Dhanya were taxes on agriculturalists. Hiranya was the king's share of certain crops paid in cash. The sources of her period also refer to the imposition of vishti, or forced labor, thereby adding to the fiscal burden of the people.
In all ages of Indian history, the caste system had played a very important role both in the religious and the social life of India, and the Gupta period was no exception to this. But in the Gupta period, we find remarkable changes in the ritual status and the actual status of the various castes in society. These changes are first visible in the attitude of the Dharma Shastras, and we find that the other factors also played a very important role in this changed scenario of the caste system. The expansion of the commercial activities and the economic activities, other economic activities like agriculture, the more and more of decline in the political authority of the central government, and more land being given away in grants, that was important considerations in this change in the social system. Previously, we find the tribes lived outside the pale of Gupta authority, but because of this expansion of agriculture, we find that more and more tribal areas came into the within the fold of the Gupta ruling areas, and retribalization had been a very important factor in the change in the caste status in the Gupta period. Here we find that different castes, they changed their status. Some went up into the social hierarchy, some remained where they were, and some went down. Especially in the case of the Vaishyas and the Shudras, we find these changes. While the Brahmins retained their importance because of their capacity to read and write and because of their knowledge of the Shastras, they maintained their status. But we find the Kshatriyas, who had been the power brokers and power sharers, they did not do so well as they did in the previous periods, and because some of the ruling dynasties in the Gupta period did not come from Kshatriya origin, and because it was accepted by the Dharma Shastras that the king not necessarily had to be of Kshatriya origin, we find that the status of the Kshatriyas were considered as acquired and not ascribed. We find some of the Vaishyas taking up the professions which were followed by the Kshatriyas earlier, and the Dharma Shastras, they accepted both the Anuloma and the Pratiloma marriages. Anuloma marriage was an endogamous marriage system in which the caste members of the castes, they married within their caste group, but in this period we find that Pratiloma marriages, where marriages took place outside the caste status, caste groups, those were accepted by society. And the other very important thing that we have to remember, that a large number of foreign elements had been absorbed and acculturated in the Indian society, that is the Yavanas, the Shakas and the Kushans who came from outside, they were all absorbed in the Indian society and were ascribed some kind of a caste status. So because of this we find that the concept of the ritual purity and the actual status went through remarkable changes in the Gupta period. Previously, we find in the agricultural system, the Shudras were just laborers, but we find that they were taking up more important activities within the agricultural system. Some of them became sharecroppers, some of them became actual owners of land, some of them entered the army, some of them took up various crafts, and some of them even educated themselves. So we find that there was a great change in the Shudra, in the status of the Shudra, whereas previously the Manusmriti took very harsh attitude toward the Shudras. We find the Brihaspati Sutra, which became important in this area, took a much more humane and much more positive and much more pragmatic attitude towards the Shudras. But we find that this improved status of the Shudras were somehow or somewhat counterbalanced by the rise of the Chandalas in this time, the growth of the number of the untouchables in society. Even Fahin, who is otherwise so appreciative of the social system of the Indians, talk about the grim reality of the Chandalas. We find that the Chandala had to announce his entry into the caste society with the use of clappers, so that members of the caste society could move away and be saved of contamination of contact with the Chandala. And those who came in close proximity with the Chandalas had to take a ritual bath in order to cleanse themselves, because the Chandala had to take up professions which were very demeaning and which was not very much appreciated by the caste society.
Most of the theoretical texts of this period follow the Manu Dharma Shastra when they say that there were 8 forms of marriage prevalent in society. They included the Brahma, Daiva, Arsha, Prajapatya, Asur, Gandharva, Rakshas and Paishachu. The first 4 forms were considered to be righteous because they followed the prescribed Jati Varna rules and required parental approval. But the last 4 were described as unrighteous because they require no ritual and no parental approval.
Writer like Vatsayana, he also shows his preference for Prajapatya marriage, no doubt, but he also thinks that the Gandharva marriage was one of the best forms of marriages. What was a Gandharva marriage? It was a marriage in which the parental consent was not followed. It was some sort of a vow between the two partners, the husband and the wife, and some plightful troth was sometimes resorted to, and it was generally a clandestine marriage. But Vatsayana shows his preference, and we find that there is reference to these Gandharva marriages in some of the texts, especially like the Abhigyan Shakuntalam, which was composed in the Gupta period. And Vatsayana holds that even Paishacha marriage was better than the Rakshasa marriage, because in the Paishacha marriage, which was to some extent considered no marriage at all, because it was the seduction of a girl while she was asleep or intoxicated, or even she was not in her proper mental order. But Vatsayana somehow holds it better than the Rakshasa marriage, which indicated the use of force. Although marriage controlled the central, no doubt marriage controlled the entire position of women, and we find that marriages within the caste was held as ideal, but this was not sometimes followed even in the royal families. We find that in the matrimonial alliances, which are very important for the growth of royal power, marriages were contracted outside the norms which were laid down by the Shastras. For instance, Prabhavati Gupta, who was not definitely belonged to a Brahmana lineage, being the daughter of Chandragupta II of the Gupta dynasty, was married to into the Vakataka family, which was definitely a Brahmana family. And Prabhavati Gupta did not even change her Gotra or her caste identity or clan identity even after her marriage into the Vakataka family. And she mentions that her brother Ghatutkacha Gupta married his niece, which was allowed in those times and considered as a valid marriage. Here, of course, the Brihaspati Sutra, which was followed in South India, was the norms were followed. The norms pertain to the laws laid down by the Brihaspati Sutra, where the marriage with the Bhagini or one's niece was considered to be an ideal form of marriage. We find that since early marriage was considered to be the best time for a woman to get married, there was very little scope for education. So education for girls were of no consideration. Only in some affluent families we find that some knowledge of the scriptures or some rudimentary performing arts were taught. Otherwise, women remained outside the pale of general education. However, like the Shudras, they were allowed to listen to the epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And since in the marriage, the husband was considered to be the superior partner, adherence to marital rules and the concept of the wife following the husband, even like the shadow, and following the laws of chastity played a very important role. We find of polygamous marriage rules, but for women it was generally monogamy, which was the accepted norm of society. We find also the first reference of the bride of Sati in this period in 510 in an inscription belonging to Madhya Pradesh in the recorded in 510 AD. We find the first archaeological reference to Sahamaran or the Sati.
Women were not entitled to property except for her Sridhan, which included only her jewelry and clothing. A more demeaning feature of this period is that women are considered to be property themselves, to be let or loaned to any other person at the pleasure of her husband. So we find that her position was steadily declining and that she was under total perpetual tutelage of some male person has been emphasized upon. So here we find that compared to the earlier ages, there are signs that the position of women was steadily declining in the Gupta period.
From much of the research now available, it is evident that the achievements that took place between 300 to 600 AD did not take place in an atmosphere of enduring stability of Fahian's imagination. Normative texts do not often give a clear picture of the complexities of the socio-economic and political life, and even the strict sastric codes often contain a measure of leniency which helps them to grudgingly accommodate practices at variance from the precepts. Corollary evidence from epigraphy and literary sources strongly suggest that social norms, as laid down in the legal treatises, especially those of marriage, caste, and occupations, were not insurmountable. In the economic arena, the initiation and development of the Agrahara system and the ruralization and localization of the economy, in combination of the emergence of hierarchized layers of landed intermediaries, radically transformed the nature of the economy. In these last two episodes, we have discussed several aspects of the social and economic dimensions. It can thus be argued that the Gupta age was an age of gentle transition, a transition that can be witnessed in the changes severally occurring. The age, designated as a proto-feudal polity, acts as a pointer to the new realities on the ground in the succeeding centuries.